Well, I am blessed to be joined by the most conservative state senator in Texas today, Bob Hall. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Bob, and joining us to talk about some really big issues that are facing Texans.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this because you're right. We do have a couple of very significant issues that people need to be aware of.
Yep. Absolutely. So I know you have been somewhat on the tip of the spear of some of the biggest issues that are getting brought up since the end of the legislative session. We've had CPS come to light with this Pardo case that we've covered here a couple times, and you've been talking about tremendously. We've told our listeners to go and read some of the op-eds that you've put out on that issue. I wanted to kind of start there, and we'll talk about the Second Amendment issues that are also kind of before us and being discussed now. Bob, when the Pardo case happened, do you mind telling our listeners how you saw that, what you did to get involved, and what you've learned so far, specifically just as a state senator?
Well, what I've learned so far could fill volumes and would send cold chills through every parent in Texas. What started out as help for a family that was in my district opened a whole new world to me of something that has been going on that was truly chilling when I found out how overreaching and abusive a state agency could be. Actually, what I've learned at the Pardo case, if it does not get reversed at the Supreme Court, I could say without hesitation that there is no child in Texas that would be safe from being taken by CPS on a whim, totally imagined and made up, and parental rights permanently terminated, and the child put into foster care, which is a disaster in itself.
You, since that case came up, how all have you engaged? I know that the court at one point, or at least CPS, tried to have you gagged and not able to speak. I know you've done some public stuff. What else have you done as far as conversations go, either with CPS or with other legislators? How have those conversations gone?
I've had a number of conversations, a number of meetings. I've had meetings with people in CPS, and I would say that was probably while most of my engagements with anybody associated with CPS have been extremely disappointing. Talking with those folks at the top of CPS were the most disappointing of all because they are in a mode of full cover-up and justification for what they're doing. They seem to have absolutely no care at all for the well-being of the family or the kids that are involved. They're supposed to have a job. I mean, there is a real need for CPS in Texas. There is no question about it. We do have children that are in situations where they need, in most cases, a temporary timeout for them from situations. But what we have is an agency that's absolutely out of control and does not understand what its role is. They do not know when to take a child. There are too many instances where they take the child when they should not be taking it, and there are too many instances where they should have taken a child and didn't. And when they do take the child, what ends up happening to that child is absolutely appalling. I mean, the 2 days after the Pardo case, we had a young baby, I think it was about 18 months old, was found dead in a trash heap in Dallas that CPS had taken and given to a family that had a sex abuser, drug user in the family. And there's story after story. And after I wrote my first article, my phone rang off the hook. I got calls from judges around the state that were telling me, well, let me tell you about the cases that CPS has come into my courtroom with that I threw them out for. I've talked to attorneys who have told me about, well, let me tell you about the case that I handled maybe 10 years ago, maybe 5 years ago. And then I get call from family members. Well, let me tell you what happened to our family. And it would bring tears to your eyes of good families that apparently just the CPS sees it as low-hanging fruit, where they can take these children, terminate parental rights, and then they've got an adoption program. And don't know all the answer to how much money the agency and the state makes off of these programs when they put a child into foster care or up for adoption, but there's money to be made there.
Do you have any sense of at what point CPS started viewing its role differently? Just in your conversations with people, is this something that's been systemic for
this has been going on for a very long. I'm talking with people who have been. Some of the ladies have been doing this for 12 or 13 years. This has been going on for quite a while. See, there are no rules, no real rules. And what rules they do have, they don't follow. They violate what few rules they have. Matter of fact, I would say without hesitation that someone accused of being a serial rapist murderer has more rights in the criminal justice system than a parent who has been anonymously accused of say, allowing their children to play outside without their shoes on unsupervised, has in dealing with CPS. The parent has absolutely no right. CPS does not even inform the parent of what they're being accused of until they've managed to extract enough information from them that if they can find something else to accuse them of, they can achieve to change the accusation. You take the Pardo case.
Yep.
This is a good example of a system that is absolutely gone wild. There was nobody, absolutely no one in CPS or at the hospital or the doctor or the court system that had ever actually seen or talked to the Pardos or to the child, had seen or talked to a neighbor, a friend, a family member, or anyone who actually had firsthand knowledge of any actual child abuse. All they ever had was a simple, short statement from a doctor who was hired to comb through medical records trying to find ways to put together an accusation of child abuse from the medical community's viewpoint. Made a statement that she had a concern from reviewing the records.
Yep.
And when I read her affidavit, in which she was put together at the request of CPS, and there's a whole story behind how they got to that affidavit.
Okay.
But that affidavit, the strongest thing she said in there was she had a concern about the medical procedures that had been done. And when I got through reading it, and I read it 3 times to make sure I was truly understanding where she was getting at, I got the impression that she should be more concerned about Medicaid fraud and improper medical treatments, because every one of the treatments that was done by a hospital, in a hospital, and doctors. The mother or the father did none of the treatments, did none of them. They had concerns about the health of their child and had gone to the medical facilities to try to get some help, and obviously weren't getting much help from them because they kept going back trying to help them understand what the problem was with the child. And yet the hospital, which is hired by, they're paid by CPS to go through and try to find cases, and the hospital makes money off of this. So they have a financial incentive. And then when they took the child, they had another financial incentive because they're now getting paid for another patient in there.
Are there any, I know part of this particular case, but my understanding, and I think some of the things that you've talked about too, is this is not the first time that this kind of Munchausen type accusation has been used, and it seems like it might even be starting to get used more often. And it seems like a really slippery slope because you're not talking about, I guess here's what I'm saying. The abuse that's being alleged is that they're seeking medical treatment that is unnecessary, but that is quite subjective, right? And so what kind of can of worms do we potentially open up if we start allowing those type of accusations to lead to the removal of a child?
What you're opening up is parents being reluctant to take their child to the doctor when they have a problem, for fear that a doctor that can figure out another way to make money off of this is going to accuse them of this Munchausen syndrome that they have by proxy.
Yeah.
And the problem we have in this case is the doctor who brought this up is a medical doctor. This is not a diagnosis that a medical, and she was making this accusation having never met or talked with the parent. But her statement, to back up just a little bit on it, when she made this initial report to CPS, she told CPS, I would like for the child to be brought into the hospital for an evaluation. Reasonable request. She saw something in the medical records and told CPS, do that. But I'm going to be out of town for the next couple of weeks, and I'll look into it when I come back. Well, when she came back into town, she saw the child had not come into the hospital for an evaluation. Called CPS and said, where is the child? And they said, well, I'm going to need an affidavit from you to do this. And so she got the affidavit, thinking, is my understanding, the way it was explained, was that this affidavit was going to be used to get the child to come in to have the evaluation. Well, it turns out the reason the child did not come in during that 2-week period was a CPS worker failed to tell the family that the doctor wanted the child to come in.
Yes.
So then the CPS worker then takes that affidavit, has it, goes to the family's house. Nobody answers the door, leaves a card there. A few hours later, the mother calls CPS and said, I saw your card here. What did you want? Well, I need to meet with you. Okay, I'm home. My husband and I are home now. And come on over. And so she said, no, I just want to meet with you and the child. He said, well, we'll be here Monday. You can come Monday and my husband will be here. No, I said, I don't want to meet with your husband. I just want to meet with you. Well, what's this about? I said, well, I'm not going to tell you over the telephone. Okay. Well, after hanging up, mother became very concerned of, one, why this caseworker was insisting to meet with her privately without the husband, and would not tell her why. So that's when they got an attorney involved in it. Even the attorney could not get CPS to tell them what were the accusations. Why did they want to meet? And then because the attorney then questioned the CPS worker, worked his way up the chain of command within CPS of questioning what they were doing, the CPS worker, and these are my words, but I could tell from her testimony in court that I was there and heard, was she just got her shorts in a knot. And she decided, I'm going to show this smart aleck attorney who's really in charge around here. So she went and drafted a false affidavit of accusations. I say false because it had false statements in it. She misrepresented what the doctor had to say, and she falsely accused the Ms. Pardo's current husband of having hit her when she was pregnant with one of the older children, which was not true at all, but that was included in her affidavit. But she managed to get an emergency extraction order that bypassed all of the system safeguards and take the child. And then once that happened into court, the judge, and this is what happens throughout the state. You get into court with CPS, and if the judge allows the child to stay with CPS out of the hearing, and CPS hands that child off into a foster care family, and that child is molested, raped, murdered, or whatever it is, the judge is off the hook. That's a CPS problem. He's safe. He or she is safe. That's a safe decision, and judges are very safety conscious. They are very risk adverse, and in this case, we had one that was extremely risk adverse. Where on the other hand, if they rule against CPS and allow the parents to keep the child, if 10 years later there is an incident, child gets spanked, well, it was the judge's fault. He should have never allowed that child to go back to that family. And I say spanked because that is considered by CPS to be child abuse. They will take a child. Matter of fact, there are many cases I've learned through this, where children have called CPS on their parents for having spanked them. And with CPS, once you are in their system, you're in it for life.
Yep.
And there are two ways that you can get in there that are just absolutely absurd. One is they accept and react to every anonymous call that they get. And no matter what their findings is, you will stay, if you were the accused in the anonymous call, you stay in their system as a potential child abuser for life. Example, Ms. Jones gets mad at Mr. Smith down the street, calls CPS, said, Mr. Smith, his kids are playing outside, they don't have shoes on and they're not supervised. They will be investigated. They may decide it was no big deal, it was all right.
Now we're taking the kids.
Or while they're there, because their procedure is milk the case as hard as you can. It may be that the children playing outside without shoes on wasn't a particular problem.
Maybe there's something
But
else.
maybe there's something else you can find that we can turn into a problem.
Yeah.
The other one is the mandatory reporting. Mandatory reporting by teachers in the education system, by doctors in hospitals, and by police officers. Another example. Mother gets out of the car quickly, locks her keys in the car, but the child is in the back seat.
Yep.
She can't get the child out.
Yep.
Has her cell phone, calls the police. Yep. Police show up right away to get the child out. No problem at all. She'll be reported to CPS as a requirement for child abuse. CPS will investigate.
Yeah, I think you told me that one a couple weeks ago, and that just blew my mind. So just correct me if I'm wrong. What you're saying is currently it is protocol that even if you accidentally lock your keys in the car, you can't get back in, you call right away 911. I got a kid here. Can you please come? They come bust the window out, take care of the kid. That opens up a CPS investigation on you as a parent. Is it? Do we know if it's like statewide, or is that just certain cities that have that as a protocol? What's the situation?
No. The protocol is if you, as a police officer, medical profession, educator, observe something with a child that could have happened as a result
of
child abuse, then you are required to report it.
Got it.
What bruise, what scratch, what incident could you not say that could have been?
Yes.
And so we have a situation where what we're doing is we're overloading the system. You know, we went and put a lot of money into CPS because they say, oh, we've got all these cases, we don't have enough caseworkers and so on. Well, they have a lot of cases because they chase too many non-cases where a lot of time and money is wasted where they should not even be bothering to look. And even in those cases, they'll spend extra time trying to fabricate or create or find something they can turn into a case to further justify it. And unfortunately, what this has done has been perceived by most of these caseworkers. They're young, unmarried females or males who don't have families, who have no concept of what a family life ought to be or is. They're just looking for pelts on their belts in how many cases can they create.
So as a senator and as a legislator, one of the things you said was, even the rules that exist often aren't even followed by CPS. So, you could pass another bill that makes another set of instructions for CPS to follow, but based on not only the Pardo case, but other cases that many of us are familiar with, they're not even following all of the existing instructions that the legislature has given them. So and I know we're early on in this discussion, right? Because this is going to lead into next session. What are some of the things that you're considering? How do you look at it from a legislative perspective, this issue?
Well, I think we're going to have to bring CPS into line with some rules and regulations. The problem we've got is there need to be significant changes made in personnel also, because they're not even following their own rules and regulations today. But we're going to have rules that give rights to parents. We need to have a Miranda. We need to have a system. See, the only people that can fight this are the affluent. We got the economically disadvantaged are at the mercy of CPS because they can't afford an attorney. and so we've got to have a system that affords people a defense.
Yep.
In this, there has to be a Miranda.
Yep.
There has to be some, and there need to be penalties for people that violate what the rules are.
Yeah.
And we need to look at the whole process.
Yep.
I mean, one of the things that happened in the court system is I became very concerned. I sat through the whole 6.5 hours of the adversarial hearing,
Yep.
and there were 3 attorneys there. One was for CPS, one was the defense attorney for the parents, and the third was the ad litem there, supposedly representing the interests of the child.
Yep.
And so as I watched and listened to what was happening, I became concerned whose interests that ad litem was really representing, because everything she had to say was like a echo of CPS. She was just a shill for CPS. And when it was over with, I brought this up with some of the folks that work these cases, had a whole lot more experience in it. And one of these things said, "Oh, don't you know about her?" And I said, "No, I've never seen her before. I have no idea," or whatever. Said, "Oh yeah, she works CPS cases quite often in helping CPS to take the child from the family and get parental rights terminated, so she can then adopt the child out." And they said that's common practice of what happens in CPS. We have these kids that are very adoptable, that come from families in which there is no real child abuse, which makes them much more desirable for adoption. Those that come out of a true abusive situation are not very adoptable.
So when it comes to some of the legislative things that you're looking at, it really kind of goes around trying to set as many procedures in place to make sure that the parental rights in these situations are protected.
Yes.
And like you said, we have a criminal justice system that assumes you're innocent until proven guilty. And so it doesn't matter if we're relatively convinced that you killed somebody, you raped somebody, you beat somebody to death, you're going to have certain protections. But CPS currently operates in kind of this unknown gray area where we don't follow all of those same situations, so that you as a parent aren't afforded the same protections of your rights as somebody suspected of other criminal behaviors that would be far worse. You might, like you said, just let your kid run outside, and yet you're allowed to be railroaded by a government agency.
Absolutely. And there has to be some definitions of child abuse.
Yeah.
And one of the most concerning is this issue of spanking. I mean, we have now a problem with discipline, and unfortunately, spanking is now been moved into be considered child abuse. And I think CPS has had a very negative, detrimental impact on what's happening because of the way they operate out there. And some of the things that they also did that we did figure out is disturbing, and I don't know how we handle this in legislation, but my interest in this and my participation in supporting the families in the visits and being there has upset CPS so much that in the second hearing they actually asked the judge to have me barred from being able to participate or say anything. They started out with trying to put a gag order, and that didn't work. And so now they had the second shot with a different judge who handled her case much more even-handedly than the first judge did. She was a very fair hearing. I think she very wisely refused to allow CPS to put the family plan into a court order, which was very good, because the family plan is a hammer that CPS uses to force families to do what they want them to do without regard to any good common sense at all. But both the CPS attorney and the ad litem attorney were so upset that I was shining the bright light on what they were doing that they petitioned the judge in the open courtroom to have me barred by name, but very wisely and even-handedly, the judge refused to do that.
Well, I know that there are very few it's not common that legislators go sit in 6.5 hour long court hearings and go on these CPS visitations. And I think it's given you a specific view of the system and perspective that is going to be, allow you to be very involved with this legislation. I think we all kind of understand that this more than likely will be a big discussion during the next legislative session, right? And so if you're a Texan that's concerned about this, and then I'd love to get to the Second Amendment, but my last question to you is, if you're a concerned parent, a concerned parental rights activist, what are some things you should be doing right now on this issue?
On this issue, I would ask them to call my office. Okay. We are already getting calls. We are building a book on the abuses of CPS, and we will have. I want to get the facts. I want to get the true stories. I mean, one of the stories we've gotten already is a mother in my district, not far from where I live, where CPS, after having almost closed the case on a problem with the husband who died, they decided they still wanted to take those kids. And the excuse was the mother wasn't intelligent enough to raise them. And it turns out this was a very good mother, very doting, loving, caring mother. But CPS wanted those kids so badly for adoption that was the excuse they used. And then we get another case from down in Houston, and this is the kind of information that we need to help us put together what we're going to do. Just the opposite of the Pardo case. This is the one where doctors had diagnosed a young girl, youngest of 3, with cancer, and they wanted to do an aggressive treatment of it. Well, this aggressive treatment would have probably damaged her liver, her kidneys, and her ovaries. And so the parents wanted to do something less aggressive first to try some alternatives. Doctor didn't like that because he was being questioned, so he went to CPS. CPS sided with him, took the children, took the child, gave her to the hospital, and authorized them to do the treatment. Fortunately, it required the child to cooperate, and she would not cooperate, so they weren't able to start right away, but they did allow the parents to visit one day. And while they were there, they grabbed the girl and left the hospital. The parents, both parents and the 2 kids were there. Dad took the 2 older kids and went home. Mother waited and went a different direction. She went to grandma's house. Police and CPS show up at the home with the dad and the 2 other kids. And guess what they did?
They took the kids?
They took the other 2 kids by force and held them hostage to have the other child returned. That's the extreme they will go to do what they want to do. It is an agency that's out of control that needs to be reined in with some very tight rules and regulations and penalties for the bad behavior. But it's those stories like that, and like the judge that called me and told me about the cases and the approach that CPS takes, that they won't even let them in their courtroom to have the hearing on them. And then in some of the areas you're talking about legislation, what they're able to do that's different in the criminal, the court documents are boilerplate. They're generalized statements that can encompass anything. Now, if you look at the Pardo case, they write in there about child abuse and sex and molestation and all other kinds of things that had nothing to do with it all, but they put it in there just to make sure they cover anything that might happen later on. They had 4 pages in their affidavit about CPS problems with domestic violence. And what it turned out to be was Ms. Pardo's previous husband had beat her a number of times, and the police had been called. It was him beating her. But they put that in there to give the appearance that it was the current husband that was doing it. That was, and it had nothing to do with this at all. But as I talk to them, I find out that's general practice to put anything in there that possibly has anything to do with abuse in any way at all, without regard to whether it's on that case or what. And there were other statements. The court documents by the court itself misquoted the doctor's affidavit, where the doctor had simply said, I have a concern, the CPS worker amplified that by, I believe her word was either serious or greatly, and then the court did the same thing by turning it. And that's a big difference between having a concern and greatly concerned.
Yep.
Just another misrepresentation of the truth.
Yep. So let's talk about guns. Let's get. I know that's a good little segue.
Did you bring yours with you today?
I do. I have mine. I had to go through security. I guess isn't a good gun owner never supposed to say whether he did or didn't bring his
right.
with him? I'm
Wrong
sorry.
answer.
I messed up the test.
Yeah.
I failed. No. Okay. So now that we know that I'm a bad gun owner and I let on too much, tell the criminals in the room too much. So since we've had a couple shootings recently here in Texas, guns have become kind of center stage as part of the conversation. And there's been a Senate committee that's discussing these different violent acts that have been taken against innocent citizens. And so this has elevated this issue both in discussion in the media and in the legislature. And I know you have been someone who's gone out there and just articulated your position, I think, relatively clearly when it comes to the path forward that you see for Texas to take, both legislatively and to what we should be promising Texans from a policy position. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about how you see the gun issue playing out right now and what your views are on the issue?
Basically, it's no compromise on further attacks on the Second Amendment. We have more gun laws in Texas. Matter of fact, I have a document that was put together by another senator that he sent me a copy of it, and it's 4 pages long of laws that we have here in Texas. Texans like to think about guns, that we're a free state, very aggressive. Actually, we lag behind many other states. Matter of fact, if you stood at the northern state line of Texas and stepped across into Oklahoma, you could take your gun, wear a gun on your hip, and walk all the way to Canada and not break a law. You could not do that here in Texas without a license.
Yep.
Without a license.
Yep.
You can't do that here in Texas. We have some laws that actually attract gun violence. Our draconian gun-free zone laws. You might as well hang a neon sign up and says, if you want to shoot somebody, come here because there's nobody here that's going to stop you. Because the fact is, guns don't kill people. People kill people. And the only way to stop a bad person with a gun is a good person with a gun. Allowing law-abiding citizens to exercise their God-given right, not our federal government constitutional given rights. The Constitution just reiterated our God-given right to defend ourselves. And so anything we do to further water down what we have, we've already taken that right away from a lot of people, particularly with the gun-free zones in there, is just further putting people at risk. And for those that are concerned about how people die, let's address the way people really die. I mean, if you go to the CDC's website, the Centers for Disease Control, they keep track of how people die.
Okay.
You have to get to item number 107 before you get to guns in quantities and how people die. And those things that are way above guns are things like swimming pools, bicycles, automobiles, stairs, bathtubs, clubs, and even hands and feet. And it's not just by a little bit.
Yep.
Matter of fact, some people enjoy is having a home with a swimming pool in it. Well, if you live in a home with a swimming pool in it and you're an adult, you are 15 times more likely to drown in that swimming pool than if you live in a home with a gun that you would be shot. And if you're a child under 15 years old, you are 40 times more likely to drown than the child that lives in a home with a gun is to be shot. If you're riding an automobile, you're 8,000% more likely to die in an automobile wreck than to be shot by a gun.
Yeah.
And annually, there are more children that are killed by their parents than are shot in mass shootings. And there are far more kids that commit suicide than are shot. And a significant number of those are a result of bullying. So if people are really concerned about how they're dying, maybe we ought to spend some time addressing an issue that school officials, the medical community, and even parents want to pretend doesn't exist, and that's bullying. But to address this as how we solve this problem is by taking guns away from people is beyond absurd.
Yep.
The issue is people. And it's how our society has changed. I mean, when I was growing up, I had a gun in the back of my pickup truck ever going to high school. I had classmates that rode the school bus who would bring their gun. If we were going to go shoot in after school, they would bring their gun riding on the school bus and have it in the classroom. And nobody thought anything about it. And today, while we do have an absolute number of more guns than we used to have ever had before, we actually have fewer homes with guns in them today per capita than we've ever had. The per capita is very low. So, and they talk about assault rifles. We've had semi-automatic. First of all, general population has no access to an automatic weapon without a license, legally. Do not have one. Semi-automatic weapons, we have had those around for as long as they've existed. We have had them, access to them. So the issue is not the gun, and it's not control. I mean, if laws would make a difference, then Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Los Angeles would have no deaths due to guns because they have the strongest gun laws in the country. But what do we have? It's just the opposite. They have some of the highest of it. In fact, it's simple. If you really believe that laws work, then all we need to do is simply pass a law that says don't break the law. And that's so doing more. And the problem where we're going with the two directions. One is the red flag issue. That's really scary because if you think back to Germany in the 1930s, one of the things they did with their red flag was if you know a Jew in your neighborhood, you turn them in. If you know somebody that needs to be reported, you tell us about them. It's not falling in line with the right. That's what you report them. And you're talking about reporting on intent, on what somebody's interpretation of intent. And the mental side of what we think we're going to try to solve this problem that we did last time in the legislature is really scary because we're talking about addressing the mental issues of adolescence. And even the American Psychiatric Association says that is an area that is very, very soft, very mushy. In their own documentation, the American Psychiatric Association says that when they do a diagnosis of a mental condition of an adolescent, they get it wrong 84% of the time. That means out of 100 kids, they're only right 16 times. The other 84, they're wrong in their diagnosis. You realize that if instead of doing those expensive tests, if all they did was flip a coin and said heads they have a problem, tails they don't, they would improve their accuracy 32%. And so doing this with children, see, the problem is you can't tell the difference between learned bad behavior and mental problems in adolescence. And so go in that direction. The other is expanded background checks. That is simply the gateway to gun confiscation. And about 5 steps from expanded background checks, you get to gun confiscation. Because from expanded background checks, no matter how limited it is, you go to universal background checks. And once you do, to do universal background checks, it doesn't work unless you have gun registration. You've got to have gun registration to have a meaningful universal background checks. And from universal registration, then you start having limited ownership, ARs, magazine size, etc. And the next thing is just plain gun confiscation. Now you got the registry, you know where they are, you go get them.
Yep.
And so it's while it may seem innocent and argue it on, gee, you really don't want criminals to have guns, do you? Why would you oppose to having a check to make sure a person isn't a criminal?
Yep.
Well, go back and look at who's doing the shootings, in the mass shootings in the schools in there. It's not criminals. That's not who's doing it.
Yep.
And so the two don't go together.
Yep. It's interesting because if you understand that evil people exist and that they want to do harm to innocent people, and you get that is part of the reality of what we unfortunately deal with in this society, whatever step you take, unless it eliminates it, they're going to want to take another step, right? And so you could say, well, I think this one instance wouldn't have happened as long as we had done this one thing. Well, guess what? The problem is there are going to be evil people that will shoot someone else after whatever gun control measure you pass happens. And then they're going to say, what's the next thing we could do? Because you've already started down the path of more government intervention means safer people. And so you have begun the debate, which means that every time we have another shooting and another shooting and another shooting, there's going to be another step and another step and another step, because we're already trying to allow the government to solve our problem. Yeah, and that kind of just a dangerous direction to go, it seems like.
Yeah, because people say, do something. The government's got to do something. And when we do something with addressing the gun, we're not doing something to stop the problem. When the problem is in our society and how our society has changed and how we have devalued life.
Yep.
And it started back in the 50s and the 60s, where in the early 60s, we took God out of our schools. And what we have found is that since then we have killed 60 million babies. We now have several states that have state-authorized assisted suicides. We have doctors assisting with suicides. We now have video games that kids play that are nothing but violence-oriented, of killing people. And there's one where if you wound somebody, you get extra points if you go back and shoot them again, so you make sure you kill them. And it's kill, kill, kill. And we've devalued life. I mean, we have no value on life. The killing of babies unborn and assisted suicides, is like life has no value. So we have created it's a mindset that's behind the people who use the gun. Or use something else. There are many more times people are killed with a baseball bat or a club than there are with a gun. There are several times more people just killed with hands and feet than with a gun. Our problem is people killing people and using whatever is at hand to do it.
When you talk about the red flag laws, I do think that's kind of the issue that ties in the whole CPS conversation that you just brought to light, where you just told us and showed us a lot of examples of where the government being given the authority to monitor, follow up, and take action against citizens has led to a significant amount of abuse when it comes to the protection of the rights of those citizens. And that's the same government. I mean, we're talking about another bureaucracy in the same state. You could have somebody who goes from the CPS caseworker to red flag caseworker, and now they're doing the same thing for people. Instead of taking their kids, they're taking their guns. And it's whether or not the government's going to be involved, or whether those people are going to have their rights protected within the process, right? And so I think that a lot of Texans have been very appreciative of you, and I know I've seen just a ton of different grassroots people all over sharing different information you've put out, both from the op-eds on CPS and even your commentary on the Second Amendment, just because it aligns with a lot of the concerns that they have, right? And so I wanted to just kind of wrap this up by saying that I'm grateful for you, but I know a lot of other people, I'm saying it on their behalf, because you've been willing to articulate these clear things. If you're a Texan who's concerned about the Second Amendment issue, and if you're somebody who's really wanting to make sure that next legislative session or whatever special session may or may not occur, that senators and representatives know that people's rights have to be protected, what should they do? How should they engage?
On that issue, they should be engaging their House member and their Senate member to express how they feel about it directly with them.
Got it.
On the CPS issue, they can do the same thing, but I would urge them to call our office.
Yes.
Email, call. Our phone number is 512-463-0102. 512-463-0102. And tell us your story. Or email us or write us. Send it to my office here at the Capitol. Get us your information, and so we can follow up and put together the history of what has been happening out there, so that it's not speculation, but it will be on actual facts of what's happening to people. We will be doing this. I've already spoken to other legislators who are just as concerned as I am. They've got other issues they're working on, and so I'm kind of taking the lead on this. But I've got support from just about everyone that I've talked to on this, on both sides of the House and both sides of the aisle. This is not a partisan issue.
Yep.
This is an issue that affects all people. And the sad part is it affects the economically advantaged minorities much more than it does others. And so this will be a partisan effort to try to address this in the next session. But I need to have those stories, the histories that you had. Whether you're an attorney, whether you're a family, or you know someone, call us. Let us know.
Well, Bob, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for giving us your time. And thank you. And I know this will be a conversation that continues. I'm sure we'll have a couple conversations between now and the next session, because these issues are going to keep coming up. So thank you for joining us.
All right. And thank you. Thank you for your interest.